Hello, everyone, and welcome to AIDS Foundation Chicago Policy Fireside Chat. This is an inaugural event as the fire truck goes past my house. It's all good. We're not on fire here. It's all good. This is the first of what will be conversations that we pop in for from time to time as different things come up that are happening in the policy world. My name is Kim Hunt. I'm Executive Director of Pride Action Tank, which is a project of AIDS Foundation Chicago, where I also serve as the Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy Operations. So we are going to talk about a lot of stuff today. Policy issues that range from the local, to state, to federal. And joining me are my colleagues today, Aisha Davis, who is the Director of Policy at AFC, and Timothy Jackson, who is the Director of Government Relations at AFC. So we are gonna just jump right in. We have 6 meaty topics, and we're gonna try to cover them in 58 minutes. And if you have any questions or want any clarification on anything, please feel free to use either the Q&A or the chat, and we will read that off. So first area that we're going to focus on is the census. There's been some back and forth on the deadline of when folks have to turn in their forms. So Aisha, you want to jump in and tell us where we are with the census?
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so excited to be here next to this lovely fire. So the census, when it kicked off earlier this year, it started on April 1st, like it does every 10 years. But then we found out a couple months in that the census period would be extended to the end of October. Then recently, I will say about a few weeks ago, we got this notification that actually the cutoff date was going to be at the end of September, which meant that's a loss of an entire month for folks to continue to fill out the census. It was also a very late in the game change, which caused a lot of concern for a couple of organizations, including AFC and Pride Action Tank, because we know that LGBTQ folks are disproportionately undercounted. We also know that people of color, especially Black, Latinx, and Indigenous folks, are disproportionately undercounted. And then here in Illinois, it's especially concerning because we are at risk of losing up to 3 seats in the House of Representatives. So that loss of a month was something that we were definitely worried about. However, we just learned, I believe maybe a week ago, that the deadline was pushed back out to the end of October. So for anyone who is listening, check in with your family, your friends, your neighbors. Make sure that they have actually filled out the census. You can do that online. If there are any issues about getting connected, there are some libraries that are still running the option of coming in and filling the census out there. You should not be concerned about that. For our immigrant communities, the citizenship question was not added to the census. There's not going to be a way for anyone to track you. There's not a way for folks to find you. It's not a concern that you have right now. So please, please encourage folks to fill out the census. The funding that's based on census results actually affects schools, healthcare, and other human services. So please be sure to do that. And yeah, I think that that's the only thing about the census. Y'all just go fill it out.
Yeah, the idea of the loss of 3 seats potentially, I mean, that's huge for any state to lose seats. And for LGBTQ folks, then we cannot lose seats. We cannot lose representation for our rights. And that includes all the identities within the LGBTQ plus rainbow. Yeah. And so related to that, were you going to say something, Tim?
Yeah, I was going to jump in and say that when we're talking about representation, congressional representation, Aisha mentioned, we also have to be mindful that the number of our congressional delegation equals the number of electoral college votes that the state has.
Ooh, yes.
And so right now, Illinois has 20. Is 2 senators, United States senators, 18 House members. So if we stand to lose 3, you know, that lessens our political power when it comes to presidential politics. And so going, say, in 2024, we could possibly be looking at Illinois no longer having 20, but possibly 18 or 17. So it's mindful there to just another reason, the importance of filling out the census.
And you mentioned the Electoral College, Tim. That's always a bone of contention, like every 4 years, especially if it's a controversial election. And this is a presidential election year. We know the Electoral College is going to be a thing. It is a thing every year, but this is already an election that is primed to be way different from anything we have ever experienced. So with that in mind, let's shift to voting. Tim, you want to start there, and Aisha, feel free to jump in.
Wow, voting. This election, well, let me start by saying, in a great year, in a normal year, presidential elections are difficult. They are very cumbersome. It comes with a lot. It's stressful. But then when you put that amid a burdening, global pandemic, civil unrest, it has become even larger. And so really voting here in Illinois, you really have 3 different ways to kind of vote. One thing that the General Assembly did back in May during their special session was add vote by mail. And for those of y'all that may not be familiar with the vote by mail part, it's really, for the most part, absentee. If you ever heard of absentee voting, that's really what it is. It's just gotten, slapped a new name on top of it. And so basically the legislation that they passed basically was that every registered voter that had voted in the last 3 large elections, whether that be the midterms of 2018, the municipal elections in 2019, or the primary elections back in March of this year, you would automatically receive an application to receive a ballot for this year's general election. You should have already received those. Those applications, all you would need to do is fill that out, get it back to your local election office, and then they would in turn send you your ballot. You can submit that online. You can do a mail-in application, or you can just call and they will send you that application. Once that ballot is received and completed, it can be returned by U.S. mail or dropped off at a secure drop box located at any early voting site. And so I cannot stress to you enough, as soon as you get your ballot, fill it out and get it back in as quickly as possible if you are interested in voting by mail. So that's one way. Early voting is another way. It's something that's not new in Illinois. But the difference with that is early voting, you must vote in person. Here in Chicago, you can use any early voting site located in the city. If you're outside of Chicago, you may want to check with your local election office to make sure. And I also remind people to make sure you check your hours and location before you visit. That way, you get there and nobody's there. And so early voting began in parts of the state beginning September 24th, with all statewide early voting locations opening no later than October 19th. And so that's a couple of weeks away for all the state. Here in Chicago, that's already begun with the opening of the super site. And then that will be expanded over the next couple of weeks. And so you do not need a government issued ID. It's not required. However, take it with you because you don't want any shenanigans. Take it with you. I would even include something with your address on it. So maybe take your utility bill. Again, for no shenanigans. It's stressful enough, so make sure you take everything that you could possibly need. It's a lot easier to take it home and you didn't need it than to get there and stand in the line for an hour and a half and you get up to the line and you're like, where's this documentation? And so just take it with you. And then there's the third way, which is election day voting. Of course, this is in-person voting. The great thing about Illinois is that you can register to vote and vote on the same day. And so that is key to remember. However, I want to put this caveat on here. Be prepared to stand in very long lines. again, I opened my comments with, in a normal year, you would be standing in long lines. It's going to be even more magnified this year, especially when you put in all of the safety precautions that we put in place because of COVID. And so those are three of the ways that you are be able to cast your ballot. If you have any questions, AIDS Foundation Chicago has a voter information center where we'll put that information in the chat, in the information below, that way you can find candidates that are up, to check your registration, register if you are not already registered, and some other helpful information as well.
I think to add to the craziness of this year is there is a possibility that we won't know the results of the presidential election.
Absolutely.
At the end of the day, at the end of election day.
Yeah, that's something that's come up in a lot of conversations that I've been a part of in the past couple of weeks. And one suggestion that I heard from somebody in a presentation during the most recent AIDS Watch virtual conference was to just not expect it. Like, don't even expect to vote or go home and just watch all the results come in. Do not drive yourself out of your mind by staying glued to the TV. I remember election night from 2016. I remember how difficult it was to keep watching everything. And I even remember how upsetting it was to see the results of the popular vote versus what happened with the Electoral College. So my suggestion to kind of take from what was said in that session is to surround yourself with folks that you love and care about that night. Do something to get your mind off of it as much as you can. For the folks who are ready to go out and protest immediately, definitely check in with people before you do that. Make sure you notify your circle. I heard that some folks are even doing phone trees. Of course, as with any protest, make sure that you are very aware of what phone numbers you need to know. Write them on your arm in Sharpie if you can't memorize them. Be careful with having phones with you because some of them can be traced. So if you turn them off before you get to the space that you plan on protesting, that's always recommended. For folks who have phones or other electronics that have, I guess, the biomedical or fingerprint or facial recognition IDs, disable it. Because here in Chicago, at least, if you disable that, the police cannot force you to unlock it manually with a code, but they can try to get you to open it with your fingerprint or your face. So just disable that feature if that's something you're concerned about. But just to run through those dates to remember that Tim talked about, early voting started in some places in Illinois September 24th. So check the website for your local elections to find out if you're in one of those areas. The Loop Super site at 191 North Clark opened on October the 1st. October 14th, all City of Chicago early voting and registration sites will be open. October 18th is the deadline to register online to vote. I know anyone who's been on social media has been hit over the head with all of those notifications on Instagram, on Facebook, on everything to say, did you register? So go register, get that done. And then on October 19th, all early voting sites in suburban Cook County are open. And then October 29th is the deadline to request a ballot. That's that absentee or mail-in ballot that Tim was talking about earlier. And it must be received by that date. So do not send it out on October 29th, y'all. Send it out at least a week early just to make sure that it's in there on time. And then the general election day is November 3rd, y'all. So just prepare yourselves for a very long night. Hopefully it's relaxing. Get some candles lit, get a fireplace like we have if you can, and just chill that night.
Thank you for running through.
I would just add, and I saw that someone placed on Facebook, you can, once you get that ballot and you fill it out, if you are not comfortable with submitting that via the United States mail system, which is a whole nother conversation we can do, there are secure voting boxes located across your county. And again, you can check all of that information, the voter information center that I mentioned earlier, and just check with your county or here in Chicago, the Board of Election Commissioners, and each ward in Chicago has a voting, secure voting location. And so you can just easily drop that information in there. It goes directly to election officials, and then you should receive some type of response back saying, hey, this has been received, it will be counted. I actually just got my email yesterday saying my ballot will be counted. And so that's a great thing. Also, something else I want to add, many of the counties are using something like a tracker from the time that they get your application to the time that they send you your ballot, like literally showing you every step of the way where your ballot is. And so that was extremely helpful for me to make sure, again, that my ballot is counted. And so that may just be something that you all can kind of keep in the back of your head. Also, one last thing on voting before we kind of move to the next topic is make you a plan of action for voting, especially if you are voting day of. Again, I cannot stress to you enough, there will be long lines. It will probably be cold. So make sure, take you a blanket, take you a little fold up chair, and just be prepared to wait it out because this election is that important.
And yeah, thank you, Tim and Aisha, for all of that. And I think we know this too, but it's also important to say, especially to our colleagues who are hardcore activists out there, we know that voting isn't the only answer. And even if you vote, it doesn't mean that you're done. There's still lots of opportunities to weigh in as a resident of the United States. For those of us who have the privilege or the burden, I guess, of being citizens of the United States, it is something. There are many ways to engage with this work, and we're going to talk about some of the different ways that the work still continues even before and after the vote. So let's shift gears a little bit to talk about something that is actually going to be on the ballot here in Illinois. And that's the other thing for folks to know. Ballots look different in different places. It depends on what's being voted on and the jurisdiction that potential piece of legislation or referendum or whatever it is covers. So one of the things that will be on the ballot in Illinois is regarding the fair tax. And I know folks are starting to see information about this, and some of us old heads have seen this conversation many times, but we're getting closer, y'all. We're getting closer. So Tim, do you want to jump back in and talk about the fair tax? Or is that Aisha's?
I think Aisha was going to lead. Yeah.
Okay.
I can take that one, no problem. So for folks who have not heard about the fair tax yet, the fair tax is going to be on the ballot this year. It is an amendment to the Illinois Constitution, right? So it's not just any ballot measure. It is something that will actually change the law of the state in a very serious way. And then it's a very important thing, okay? So Illinois is the first place to talk about having a fair tax. We're not the only place that's thinking about doing something like this. But really, the fair tax is a way for us to have, instead of a flat tax rate for any income level, it would be a progressive tax that it would impact actually only about 3% of folks, right? In terms of an increase in the taxes that you would pay. And that's just income taxes, y'all. So 97% of Illinoisans will have either a tax cut or continue to pay the same taxes that they pay right now. And to put that in perspective, unless you're making over $250,000 a year, you do not have to even worry about this. And in fact, it might actually give you a better opportunity to pay fewer income taxes. And doing this, changing this constitutional amendment, or like adding this constitutional amendment, I should say, will raise more than $3 billion a year to fund state and local governments, schools, and human services. So a lot of folks have been talking about it. I've seen some signs both for and against the fair tax, but honestly, at the end of the day, it is something that will make it so that our state has more money to work with providing those resources and services that we need. It will make sure that our schools are working better. It will make sure that we're not talking about as much of a deficit. And that is something that is very, very serious for us right now as a result of the pandemic and the recession that has come after it. Illinois is facing a multiple billion-dollar deficit just because of COVID-19. So having something like the fair tax is a way for us to generate more revenue for the state without actually harming the communities that we really need to care for and provide more services to. So if you hear people talking about how having a flat tax is equality, and so it's better for us. That's actually not the language that we're trying to use right now. What we're talking about is equity. What we're talking about is making sure that those who are able to pay more do pay more, right? And it's not us saying that we're going to try to take everything from folks. We understand all the hard work that people do to raise money, to bring money in for their families. But what we are talking about is making sure that people are supporting our communities in a way that is fair and equitable, and really making sure that those communities who have also been hit hardest by COVID-19, we're also talking about communities where you're seeing people living with and vulnerable to HIV, right? We're talking about providing more healthcare services, more school, more education, all of these things. So AFC is proud to support voting yes on the fair tax. It's something that we've been talking about internally. We've been a part of a couple coalition meetings as well. And there'll be more information about that on that voter information center that Tim mentioned that we dropped the link to. So definitely go there and look out for that tab. Go and read all the materials we have on it. And I believe that we'll be publishing some other pieces to talk more about the fair tax. So definitely look out for those and follow AFC if you're not, so that you can see when those drop.
Yeah, and what I want to add here is that, you know, we're talking about policy issues right now, and that can be, for some people, it's just like, what is that? And you know, just like, so I'm a sneakerhead, just like I do my research for my sneakers. I haven't posted my picture on Instagram yet. But just like I do my research for my sneakers, you got to do your research too on policy, because the impact is huge. And, you know, I'm a person who's a graduate of a public policy school, and I went to public policy school because I wanted to make a bigger impact. And that's what public policy does. The hope is that the impact is good. And so that's why we still have to be advocates and activists to make sure that we clean up any issues that may occur. But this is serious business. You know, we live in a state and a city where your zip code determines the quality of the education that you got. And that should not be the case. The fair tax is one way to get at that for education as well as for other issues. And so I really encourage folks to look into it, check out our voter information center. It's got lots of information there. One thing folks should know too is that when they vote, you can take information into the polling place with you that explains or provides information on candidates and issues, as long as it's not partisan, as long as it's from a reputable, objective source, you can take that in with you. So I know sometimes when you see the ballot, you see all those names, you see all those issues, and, you know, you're just trying to make a living every day and go to work, pay your bill. So, you know, you can gather information and take it with you. And again, check out our voter information center.
Yeah, Kim, I would just add just a couple more things about the fair tax. One thing that we've seen with COVID is highlighted so many inequalities and disparities when we talk about income inequality, whether you're talking about housing or food insecurity, of course, health disparities and inequities. This is really passing the fair tax allows us to receive the resources to begin addressing some of these issues that have been at the forefront way before COVID, ever stepped on the scene. And unfortunately, we'll still be here long after COVID leaves. And so this is really kind of a great first step for us to begin addressing some of these disparities in a very intentional way. Directly, targeting those people, like these frontline workers for COVID that, are shouldering the burden of this tax structure, where their tax rate is the same as someone making 15 times the one they're making. That's not right. We understand that. And so we can begin to, put a first, foot forward to fix some of these issues.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you brought up COVID. So we know at the federal, state, local level, all levels of government are dealing with this in different ways, both in terms of the public health issue, but also the funding and other resources that need to happen. And there have been multiple COVID-related bills at the federal level. And we're hearing information about the HEROES Act again, since our president was released from the hospital and stopped negotiations, then indicated through a few tweets that is open to some piecemeal options. We'll see what happens, but let's look at the HEROES Act and maybe sort of an overview of the way relief has come from the federal level since the pandemic began.
Absolutely. So at the federal level, we've had a few different bills that have been passed in response to COVID-19 and the pandemic and how it's been affecting us. I think that folks are most familiar with the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, or FFCRA, and the CARES Act, the acronym that I have forgotten. But the CARES Act was the one that talked about and put in place all the PPP loans, the $1,200 I called it a stipend at one point, but like a supplemental payment from the government to help folks, or the stimulus checks that we were all talking about for a couple months and that we all received one of if we were able to. So in the months that have happened since that one-time payment back in, I believe, April, May-ish, we have not had the opportunity to see much movement for the next round of assistance, right? So since the CARES Act, there was a smaller act that was passed that added more funding to all of the PPP loans that were available to businesses, but there was nothing that happened on an individual level for folks. And so that is the thing that the HEROES Act is trying to tackle. So in June, the first version of the HEROES Act made it through the House of Representatives, right? The Democrats in the House pushed it forward, but it got no traction in the Senate. A couple months later, the Senate responded with a series of bills that were called the HEALS Act, which allocated a lot of funding towards things that are not actually really directly related to the COVID-19 pandemic, such as trying to find funding to build a new FBI building in DC. And as someone from DC, I can say that that's probably not what people in DC are worried about the most right now. But I will say that the HEALS Act, when you look at the HEALS Act and the HEROES Act next to each other, you can kind of see the focus of which one was most prominent in those conversations, right? So the HEROES Act started back in June as a $3 trillion package that would include, not only funding for state, local, and territorial governments, but also another round of funding for families. But it did have a cap at $6,000 per household for folks receiving those stimulus checks. That version, like I said, made it through the House, but did not make it through the Senate. And so a couple of weeks ago, there was a revised version of the HEROES Act that came down. That version, I'm going to give a few numbers about, especially talking about areas that are really big for AFC, and I'm hoping for our constituents listening in. This most recent version would give $10 billion towards supplemental nutrition assistance programs, so SNAP. SNAP benefits would get more funding. I know that that's something that was increased. I know that there was a lot of conversation around the PEBT program. So that would be $10 billion more for SNAP. $400 million for WIC participants. So that's the women, infant, and children participants. $450 million for the Emergency Food Assistance Program, or TFAP. $900 million for tribal government needs necessary to prevent, prepare for, and respond to COVID-19, which is absolutely important because Indigenous communities and reservations have been hit the hardest by the COVID-19 pandemic, to the point where I've heard that a number of territories have actually been locked down due to the spread of the pandemic. $249 billion would be for Health and Human Services to support public health, research, development, manufacturing, procurement, and distribution of vaccines and therapeutics related to COVID-19. Additionally, there would be $100 million for Ryan White clinics, $65 million for housing opportunities for people with AIDS, or HOPWA, $13.7 billion for the Centers for Disease Control, and $8.5 billion towards Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. So all of these numbers They're very large, but they also need to be, because the COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in such an economic downturn for this country. I know that folks are probably following the unemployment rate that has gone up significantly since the start of the pandemic. I know we've all been hit personally by this, not only in terms of people having to deal with COVID-19, just people being infected by it, people dying from it, people having all the long-term effects associated with it that we're still learning about, but also just folks' personal, like, mental health, social engagement. All of these things have been hitting us in very significant ways. And the HEROES Act is a way for us to get a little bit of relief. There would be some funding allocated for additional stipends or stimulus checks. There would be some funding allocated towards state and local governments, as well as those territorial governments that I mentioned earlier. And again, that's something that would be very important for the state of Illinois, especially because we are facing such a large deficit in the coming year, well, the coming 2 years, I should say. So we're hopeful that the HEROES Act will have better traction. I believe this version of the HEROES Act is closer to $2 trillion as opposed to $3 trillion, which 2 to 3 doesn't sound like a big leap, but when you're talking about trillions of dollars, that is a pretty significant chunk of money. But we're hopeful that the representatives from our Illinois congressional delegation, who have been supportive of these measures, who have really been pushing for our federal government to be responsive and actually allocate funding to the people and the resources who need it the most. We hope that they're successful and that we see some kind of traction before the end of the year. Like Kim mentioned, our president definitely tweeted a few things. There was one tweet that talked about how folks wouldn't get any relief until he was reelected, which is problematic anyway, because it assumes what the results of the election will be. But then also seeing some subsequent tweets talking about pulling money together to bail out airline companies, as opposed to trying to pull money together to reach individuals and families who are struggling the most right now. So I think that this is another reason why we're talking about this, another reason why we want to provide the information to folks, because it's things like these that really influence, I believe, how folks will vote and what issues they want to bring up to their representatives.
Wow, Aisha, that was a lot you just went through. I really appreciate that. And I think to demystify this a little more, can you track this all the time? So can you just share some of the sources that you look at when you're trying to find out what's happening with this?
Absolutely. So I will say that the government sometimes puts out these one-pagers, so I'll make sure that we send out those one-pagers to folks who've registered and like any subsequent communication. But the federal government does release some one-pagers about bills, especially very large bills like the HEROES Act. They are sometimes very difficult to find, though. So usually I either look at listservs that have either weekly emails that talk about federal policy changes. We're in a number of coalitions that talk about federal policy changes. It's honestly a combination of staying in touch with as many people as possible, and then also setting up different alerts. For folks who don't want to necessarily dive into coalitions or sign up for a ton of listservs, I also would suggest creating Google alerts. So make the technology work for you. You can set it up to search for specific language. So for example, if you want to find out about funding specifically related to helping people living with or vulnerable to HIV, you can set up an alert for HOPWA, an alert for Ryan White, things like that. And if you want to track things like SNAP benefits or WIC, you can put alerts up for that. I personally have alerts set up for the Affordable Care Act. I have one set up that actually looks at HOPWA and Ryan White. But those are ways to kind of help make the technology work for you. And then additionally, I would say definitely keep up with AFC, because our P2A resource is a way for us to reach out to you and to let you know which ways that you can help take action.
Thank you for sharing that. And I wanted to call that out because you two are brilliant, smart people, but you're not magic, right? You know, you don't just know this. You don't just know it. This is information that you have to seek out, and it's information that's available for anyone. So again, our goal for these chats are really to demystify this work in part, but also to explain what's going on. So thank you for that, Aisha. So let's move on to another big piece of work here that is happening at the state level. You know, we've talked about anti-racism and criminal justice reform and these kinds of things for a while, and then things like this are really bubbling up to the surface over the last few months, particularly since the George Floyd murder. So the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus has a whole anti-racism policy agenda that they're going to try to move during the veto session, right, Tim?
That's correct.
First of all, explain what the veto session is, and then and maybe like the overview of the Illinois General Assembly timeline and that kind of thing. And
Sure.
Then you dive in.
Yeah, sure. Generally, the General Assembly meets from about the end of January to the end of May in a normal year. And so, of course, we know this is not a normal year. And generally, that's where they consider a number of different pieces of legislation. They're responsible, of course, for passing the next year's budget. And so this year's session was extremely cut short. And so at the end of May, they met and passed a number of bills related specifically to COVID, as well as the fair tax, vote by mail, and of course the budget. Those were really kind of the four large buckets that they worked on. Fast forward generally, and again, in a typical year, veto session is a time that's usually sometime October, where they basically, the General Assembly meets back to consider vetoing or reconsidering a piece of legislation or pieces of legislation that the governor has vetoed that they passed back earlier in the year. This year is going to be a bit different because there's not very many vetoes, if any, that I've been able to see. And so this year, a large portion of what is going to be discussed during veto is the Legislative Black Caucus's basically anti-racism policy agenda to address criminal justice reform and a number of other issues. Really, the Legislative Black Caucus, as we kind of saw the fallout with the George Floyd killing, as well as we've kind of seen the growing disparities among Black and Brown communities when it comes to COVID-19, there was really kind of a convalescing around we need to do something to address these issues, these structural racism type issues. And so we really need to do something to address that. And so the Legislative Black Caucus has come up with really kind of four pillars to address these issues. One of which is criminal justice reform, violence reduction, and police accountability. That's one of them, very long. Another one is education and workforce development. We kind of hinted on education earlier, that it shouldn't matter what zip code that you're in, that your zip code shouldn't dictate the type of education that you receive. And so we want to be, they want to be very intentional about reaching out on that. Something else we talked about earlier, economic access, equity, and opportunity. We talked about that in relation to the fair tax. But again, this is another opportunity where we have seen Black people being very harmed disproportionately when we talk about economic access and equity issues. And then, of course, there's healthcare and human services. And we've kind of seen how that's played out with COVID. And so those are really the four large buckets. As of right now, and I can hit on a couple of these in just a few moments, there's not any legislation as of right now, but leaders with the Legislative Black Caucus have assured people that legislation will be available for veto, which begins on November the 17th. So it runs on the 17th, 18th, and 19th. Which is the week before Thanksgiving, and then they come back to Springfield the Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday following Thanksgiving. And so I can't remember those dates, the beginning part of December off the top of my head. But yeah, and so to talk about criminal justice, which is one of the large pieces, essentially what's kind of been said, they've been looking at a number of different issues within criminal justice they wanted to kind of really target. and tackle. Ending the state's cash bond system for those awaiting trial. Rolling back mandates that those convicted of certain crimes serve at least a certain amount of their prison sentence to mandatory minimums. Reducing penalties for those convicted of drug crimes. Enact policies that would limit an officer's ability to use force. So use of force is a huge thing, of course, that we've been discussing. Offering more training on crisis intervention. Adding transparency in police data. Many legislators have been very vocal about there's just not a lot of data out there. So how can you really start trying to implement change when the data is not there, which makes sense. And then, of course, holding police officers accountable for their for bad actions. And so those were, kind of from the Legislative Black Caucus, kind of a litany of issues that they want to tackle within the criminal justice piece. The governor and his staff yesterday announced his 7 guiding principles to build a more equitable criminal justice system. And they've been working on this for quite some time, and was going to be a large policy plank for them pre-COVID. And so, some of these same type of things are showing up in the governor's policy platform regarding criminal justice system, including ending the use of cash bail, increased police accountability, transparency for police officers and police departments, strengthening statewide standards for use of force, again, modernizing sentencing laws. So we're talking about these mandatory minimums. And so those are really kind of correlating. The governor, when he announced these 7 principles yesterday, said that he is still committed to working with the Legislative Black Caucus on the other 3 pillars of their, much larger agenda, whether that's related to economic access, educational workforce development, and of course, healthcare and human services. So they've been holding, the Legislative Black Caucus has been holding subject matter hearings over the past couple of months, meeting with stakeholders, testimony, and all of that. And so, those will still be going on. There was one yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, there's one Friday, there's one sometime next week on healthcare that they'll begin working on. And so it's very interesting discussion. And so, I'll stop there.
Tim, can we share those dates maybe on Facebook, or I'm talking to my comms team too,
Yep.
for those hearings? That would be great. And thank you for sharing that. More to come for sure. And I know we'll
Absolutely.
be hearing more as we get closer to veto.
Yep.
I also want to remind people to put questions or comments in the chat. I'm starting to see some. And for those of you who are on Facebook, feel free to add them there because we're monitoring that as well. So I think we have all the same. One more big area to cover.
It is, yes.
Just for those of you who are keeping score, we have gone through so far the census, voting, the fair tax, federal COVID-19 relief, the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus anti-racism policy agenda, and now we are moving to Supreme Court decisions. Woo!
We absolutely are.
Wow. Yeah.
So before we segue into that, I'm actually going to pick up on something that was mentioned in the chat. One of our colleagues, Jim, brought up the executive order that came down recently from the president about ending federal funding for anti-racist trainings. That is something that would impact federal agencies in terms of the trainings that happen within those agencies, in addition to affecting those organizations and agencies that receive federal funding, right? So really this executive order, the language in it was upsetting to say the least. It was one of those situations where you're reading something and you feel like it's not quite saying what it says it's saying. So there were a lot of statements within this executive order talking about really like getting back to the values of the founders of the United States, but actually in effect, what it is doing is creating this chilling effect for all of the organizations that receive federal funding, all of the federal agencies. I have a number of family members and friends who work in those agencies, and I've worked with organizations that receive federal funding, including AFC, right? So this executive order is saying that you cannot use this federal funding to fund trainings that are anti-racist, right? Some of the language included in this executive order also discussed any kind of training that would, I guess, state that there are any groups that are inherently one way or another. There was some language in there saying that this move was to prevent discrimination in the future. However, we all know that eliminating funding for anti-racist training or any kind of diversity, inclusion, and education training will have the opposite effect, right? It will make it a situation where people are not able to learn about the history of systemic racism in this country and any of the issues that we're facing right now. So like Tim mentioned, when we're talking about the murder of George Floyd, we're talking about the murder of Breonna Taylor, we're talking about even more locally, Rekia Boyd, right? Like we're talking about Laquan McDonald. All of these conversations, we know that all of those services that are supposed to protect us are not always doing so, right? So having any funding like this pulled, and like Jim is letting me know more details, absolutely, Jim, from all of these organizations that are really trying to use conversations around equity, around inclusion, to remove barriers and actually get people access to healthcare, to services, to help educate communities, really. It's extremely problematic. I will say that Tim, Kim, and I were in a meeting before this conversation where we did talk about this with some of our elected officials. It is on their radar. Additionally, we've been in conversation with some of our coalition partners and partner organizations. I like to call us our accomplice organizations. We've been talking about this issue because it affects all of us. I will say that this especially harms smaller organizations that do not have the capacity and funding to really divide funding streams and show clear delineation between what some funding is used for and what other funding is used for. So I'll use another example that happened earlier in this federal administration where there was a freeze put in place around funding for abortion services, right? Where FQHCs were not permitted to discuss or provide abortion services. For places that are large, where you can have the money to buy two separate storefronts, right? So if you have a clinic that is an FQHC that has one space here and one next door, and only next door can you talk about abortion or any kind of reproductive rights, they can kind of show that separation. When you're talking about organizations that maybe have 1, 2, 5, 10 people on staff completely, there is no way to do that. There is no way to really show that delineation. There's no funding to buy two separate storefronts. There's no place to have two offices. So the real harm here is that it means that people who really want to not only continue educating folks and continuing us on this like pathway towards equity are being stopped. And it harms our communities because it means that our communities don't have access to this information. And it really tries to freeze these conversations. I will just say that this is something that AFC CEO John Peller has talked about. This is something that he has said is not going to stop AFC in our work towards equity. So do not worry, AFC is still here. We're still fighting for this issue. And it's something that we'll definitely keep you all up to date about. So thank you for bringing this up, Jim. And now I think we have 11 minutes. Oh, go ahead, Kim.
Yeah, Aisha, before you go there, I was going to do a time check too, but I just want to remind people that is also why it's not just about the election, right? You have to continue to engage with your elected officials even after voting. And, sign up for AFC's Phone to Action. We send alerts. We'll drop that in the chat too, that information. You can find out who your federal representatives are, your state representatives as well, and let them know that you see this as an important issue that they need to be pushing back on. And that goes for any issue that's important to you. Okay, there you go.
All right, so this is where I kind of like dust the fingers off and really get into some quick talking. As everyone is aware, we lost a tremendous pillar of equity on the Supreme Court recently with the loss of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And this empty seat means that the GOP is rushing to do a 180 from what they said at the end of President Obama's term and are trying to appoint a new justice in this time. We don't know what that's going to look like. The recent wave of COVID-19 diagnoses, not only in the GOP, but also in the White House, has meant that a lot of these conversations are a little bit in flux, but it's something that we're absolutely watching. The reason why the Supreme Court matters so much is because of all the precedent-setting cases that are coming through and that have been decided in like the recent term. So I'm going to touch on a few things, and then I'm going to turn it over to Tim and Kim to ask any clarifying questions or add any details. All right, y'all. First up, the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare, aka the ACA. It's something that, of course, AFC is a huge supporter of. It is something that is extremely important, not only to people living with or vulnerable to HIV, but to all LGBTQ folks, to people of color, to any communities that are accessing Medicaid, right? This is something that is tremendously important and also very, very concerning. The Affordable Care Act case right now, California versus Texas, is set to be heard on November 10th, which is just a week after the election date. We might not even have the election results then. So I'm just letting you all know that. So the ACA case is one where Illinois is one of 17 states that, well, 17 states and the District of Columbia that is defending the Affordable Care Act. 4 additional states joined the ACA defense on appeal, and 8 states have filed amicus briefs defending the Affordable Care Act. The basic premise is that this case has been set up as a challenge to the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act's individual mandate, with the federal government and 18 states arguing to that point, supporting the unconstitutional nature of the individual mandate. Let me break this down for folks who are not policy people, right? The ACA's minimum essential coverage provision is known as the individual mandate. The individual mandate provides that most people must maintain a minimum level of health insurance coverage, and that those who do not maintain that minimum level of health insurance coverage must pay a financial penalty. That financial penalty is known as the shared responsibility payment, and that is to be paid to the IRS if you don't maintain that minimum level. The individual mandate was upheld as constitutional by the Supreme Court in 2012 because it was deemed a constitutional exercise of Congress's taxing power, okay? With that being said, in 2017, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act set the shared responsibility payment to $0 as of January 1st, 2019. As a result, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit held that the individual mandate is no longer constitutional because that financial penalty no longer produces revenue for the federal government and can therefore not be considered a constitutional exercise of Congress's taxing power. So because that penalty is not bringing in money through the federal government, through the IRS payments, it's being considered unconstitutional under that very specific premise. The House of Representatives and the states defending the ACA are asking the court to use the severability doctrine, it's another legal doctrine, to determine that the ACA is still constitutional even if the individual mandate is considered unconstitutional. The ACA is a very, very large piece of legislation. The individual mandate is one small part of that. So what the House of Representatives and these 18 states are saying is that if you just take out that part, even if you declare that part unconstitutional, there is so much more to the ACA that should still be in place, right? So when we're talking about what's at stake, just in Illinois, the number of people without health insurance would jump by 128%, meaning that we would have 1,150,000 people losing their health insurance if the ACA is overturned. We would lose $4.2 billion in federal health care money. And that's 47,060 jobs, which is 7.8 out of every 1,000 jobs in the state of Illinois gone. Disproportionately, we're talking about people living with HIV. We're talking about LGBTQ identified folks. We're talking about Black, Latinx, and Indigenous folks, right? So all those communities that have already been hit hard by COVID-19, who are already in the midst of this like racial reckoning moment, right, are also at risk of losing very important healthcare access. So that is the huge ACA case. Also, feel free to drop any more comments and things in the chat and the questions. I'm going to keep pushing to the next case so that we can get through it. Another thing that's come up since Justice Ginsburg's passing is the question about Roe v. Wade. So concern around this landmark case has been around since 2016 elections because President Trump has been saying that he wanted to overturn Roe as early as a debate in October of 2016, saying if we put another 2 or perhaps 3 justices in, that will happen. And that'll happen automatically, in my opinion, because I'm putting pro-life justices on the court, right? So this is something that Trump has projected for 4 years already. And although he said that we don't know how his nominee, Amy Coney Barrett, would actually rule on a rehearing, he said that in the last debate last week, or the first debate, I should say, last week, Law professor Barrett signed a letter calling Roe v. Wade barbaric years ago. So we already kind of have an idea about where she stands on that point. However, I will say that is a federal level conversation that we're talking about when we say the Supreme Court. Here in Illinois specifically, we are one of 11 states that have passed bills protecting abortion rights, okay? So in Illinois, we have a state law that means that you will still be able to access abortion services. So in 2019, Illinois passed this law in response to a wave of anti-abortion legislation being passed in other states. Also, I will say last week, New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy backed legislation that would codify a law like this in New Jersey. So again, when we have these concerns about any waves overturning Roe, states kind of jump into action. So just know that in Illinois, that state law is right there to protect you. Another case that I'll bring up is Obergefell versus Hodges. That is a case that I'm sure a lot of folks are familiar with because it is our marriage equality case. However, just I believe this week or late last week, Justices Thomas and Alito we're talking about this case that was brought by Kim Davis, who is the court official who did not want to provide people with marriage licenses. Her case was not, it was denied cert, which means that it's not going to be heard before the Supreme Court. However, Justices Thomas and Alito issued a statement afterwards saying that Kim Davis was one of the first victims of the Supreme Court's cavalier treatment of religion, and they have concerns about people being labeled as bigots, and that issue is more persuasive to them than the loss of civil liberties for LGBTQ people. And depending on that empty seat and or who is nominated, there's a chance that Obergefell may be overturned. What that means is that states that are not like Illinois, so Illinois, again, we have state level protections, but states that do not have these state level protections are at risk of having this huge piece of civil liberties being overturned for queer folks. Additionally, okay, I'm just gonna keep pushing through. Recently, we had a decision from the case Bostock versus Clayton County, Georgia. In June, the Supreme Court held that it is a violation of Title VII's prohibition on sex-based discrimination to fire someone based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. In Illinois, we have additional protections towards that under the Illinois Human Rights Act. And this is another case that we're watching very closely depending on what happens with the Supreme Court nominee process. Additionally, just jumping into some conversation around voting rights, which is a huge, huge concern right now. So in addition to getting out and voting this year for this election, we're also going to keep watch over what will happen in subsequent elections, right? There was a recent, I think it was a recent decision in South Carolina around how ballots will be counted. I'm sure that there's information on that. I'm not well versed in that, but I will say that the quick changes happening right now, this close to an election, are the reason why we're watching Supreme Court cases like the ones I'm about to talk about. So I might be mispronouncing this, but Brnovich versus the Democratic National Committee and Arizona Republican Party versus the Democratic National Committee are two cases that were granted cert. So they will be heard before the Supreme Court. They will be joined together, and they are both from Arizona, and they're consolidated and were granted cert last Friday. And this is a case that in the line of Shelby County versus Holder and Abbott versus Perez will essentially gut the Voting Rights Act, right? So Shelby and Abbott already hit on two really important pillars of the Voting Rights Act. This case will hit on that third really essential one. And right now, these upcoming cases may actually get rid of the protections that have kept a lot of states that had very discriminatory voting practices in place from doing so. This is something that tremendously affects LGBTQ communities, Black communities, Latinx communities, and Indigenous communities. These two cases will consider two Arizona laws that will require officials to discard entire ballots cast by voters who vote in the wrong precinct. So like Tim said, in Chicago, you can kind of vote in any ward when you're early voting. This would mean that if you did not vote in your ward, your ballot is gone, regardless, even like outside of those local election questions. The other law would prohibit a third party from submitting an absentee ballot for a voter. That means that if your grandma can't make it out to the polls and she gives you her absentee ballot, you can't drop it off for her anymore because this law would restrict the ability to do that. I will say that the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals stated that there was uncontested evidence in the district court established that minority voters in Arizona cast out of precinct ballots at twice the rate of white voters, and that Indigenous and Latinx voters are especially likely to rely on having another person submit their absentee ballots. So this is something that we're looking at because of the really harmful results of these kinds of laws. And it's something that we'll definitely keep up with and let you all know about. I know that we're at the 1 o'clock moment, so I'm going to just stop here.
Wow, I think you need a round of applause for that because you covered a lot of ground. Wow. So we're a minute over. So I just want to say, first of all, thank you to Timothy and Aisha for making yourselves available to do this. We covered a lot of ground today. We are going to do another one on October 28th. Our colleague Meg is going to send information to those of you who registered, and then of course we'll be publicizing this. And if there are any specific questions that you want answered or topics that you want covered, just let us know. You can post them in this chat right now. If you're watching through Zoom, you can also post on Facebook and we will try to accommodate you. But for now, thank you so much for joining us on our first policy fireside chat. We hope you loved it. Give it a thumbs up, like they say on Instagram, and keep fighting, y'all. We have a lot of work to do. And vote and fill out your census form. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.